guys, it's Jen. This is another episode of Reframing Me, and I'm your host, Dr. Jennifer Brubaker. Welcome back to the show. I am so grateful to have you here today with me. If you are new, I am so happy that you have found us here. Today, I thought we could have a conversation about something that every parent of teens has probably experienced. Even if maybe we don't realize it or we don't always have the language for what it actually is. Now, I'm very confident to say this because I have had it happen to me 3 times this week. And so I kind of felt like if I have noted it 3 times in my own parenting, then y'all must have had it happen at some point, right? It's those moments when your own past kind of sneaks up into your parenting. Something that your teen may be going through, it just kind of sparks an old memory or a feeling. And suddenly you're not just the mom. It's like you're also the 15-year-old version of yourself who's standing in her shoes all over again. Now, just to be clear from the beginning, when I talk trauma, I am not talking about deep trauma here. If you have experienced significant trauma, that is sacred work. That is much deeper and needs to be handled with a professional, not here in my podcast episode. What I am talking about today are the smaller, everyday wounds, the breakups, the disappointments, the hurt, the embarrassment, the awkwardness of adolescence. The kind of things that we really had thought we'd left behind, or maybe thought that we had forgotten, but that have a way of sneaking up and resurfacing when we see our own kids going through something similar. It's those narratives that we carry, the stories that we were told, and the stories that we continue to tell ourselves. Some of those narratives, yes, they totally help us, but some of them, they can limit us. And when we don't pay attention, they can sneak into our parenting in ways that are just not fair to our teens because their story deserves to be their story. It doesn't deserve to be a continuation of ours. Like, have you ever watched your child walk into an event where they didn't really know anybody or have friends, first day of school, something like that, and you just kind of felt your heart race, like you were the one who felt out of place. You were the one who was afraid you weren't going to make any friends or not find a place to sit or not find a group to be with. Or maybe your child didn't make a sports team and suddenly you are reliving the sting of your own rejection. That's because memory isn't just mental. It is physically embodied in our muscles, in our nervous system. We store those past experiences. And when we see something familiar, it can feel like it's happening to us all over again. It can be an echo. Now, in communication theory, we talk about social learning theory. And social learning theory tells us that we develop scripts for how to act and how to react based on what we experienced and what we observed as we were growing up. Now, those scripts, they become our default lens, our frame to see the world. So when our teen hits a milestone or has an experience that mirrors something from our past, we just kind of instinctively apply our script, even though their context and their world and their personality might make the script entirely different. The danger is that we project. We assume that if high school was brutal for us, it will be brutal for them. Or if we were devastated by a breakup, well, then they must be feeling the same way. We end up parenting our own teenage self instead of the teen who is in front of us. The first step is doing what I did this week and simply noticing. Like, ask yourself, am I responding to their moment, or is this a response to my own memory? Practice that pause that we talk about. That pause can be everything. Maybe you've been blindsided. It's a memory that you had totally forgotten. You're standing at your teen soccer game and they get subbed out. They are clearly frustrated, and suddenly you are back on your own middle school team, sitting on the bench, trying to pretend that you didn't care that you weren't good enough to stay in the game. Or your child doesn't get invited to a party, and the rejection hits you harder than it hits her. It's like all of a sudden the ghost of your seventh grade self, the one who didn't get picked, who always felt a little on the outside, maybe she suddenly pops up and shows up in the passenger seat of the car when it should be your daughter who's in the passenger seat. That's the kind of thing I mean when I say echoes. Those little reverberations of the past that can get stirred up by our kids' experiences. We maybe think we've moved past them, maybe even forgotten them. And suddenly the emotion is there again. It's not just in our heads. Communication research and psychology both tell us that our bodies carry those stories. We remember. When something reminds us of a past hurt, our heart rate, our breathing, even our posture can all change. It's like we are literally reactivated. And when we are in that reactivated state, we start to overlay our story onto our child's. And that's why parenting can feel so heavy sometimes, because it's not just their moment, it's our past moment layered on top. And that's when you have to really start paying attention to when your response might feel out of proportion. I can remember when my oldest was in first grade, and I can picture out on the playground. I would go and do my recess duty, and I could picture him standing there kicking the ball to the wall and playing by himself, just kicking the ball against the brick wall of the school. All the other kids are playing in groups or with others, and he was there kicking the ball by himself. And it would worry me. I was like, why is he so sad? Like, he's off by himself. Does he not have any friends? Nobody wants to play with him. He is off alone and he is so sad. And I was making up these stories in my head because you know who was alone on the playground in elementary school? That would be me. And yes, I still remember 40 years later who the kids were who didn't pick me for their teams. I remember. I haven't forgotten. I'm going to start outing everyone. But I would bring my own story to that playground when I would go. And it was week after week on my recess duty, I would see him. And finally, I was talking to his teacher, and she told me how he might enjoy playing by himself because at home, he doesn't have that opportunity. And it made me really start to think about it. And so I started having conversations with him and came to the realization that he liked the alone time. At home, he had to constantly share. He was constantly with others. He had a brother who was 21 months younger than him and a sister then who was 18 months younger than that. So he always was with others. He was always sharing. And he actually enjoyed being alone. I didn't have that experience growing up because my sister was enough younger than me that we didn't have that same kind of closeness. And I couldn't see that his story was so different than mine. I went to school and I went to recess and was heartbroken that I wasn't good enough to be picked for that kickball team. I'm clearly not over this. But he went to school and it wasn't that at all. He liked to have 20 minutes to himself with a ball that he could enjoy. I was laying my story, my narrative, apparently my trauma over his experience. Now, let's look a little bit farther and widen the lens from like a specific echo to the bigger narratives that we carry, because it's not only those individual memories that shape our reaction. It's the whole set of stories we were told about what life is supposed to look like. because beyond specific memories, we have the scripts or those family mantras that kind of shaped how we understood life. Maybe you grew up hearing that heartbreak makes you stronger, or boys don't cry, or if you wanted to be somebody, you have to be popular, right? You have to dress this way, or good girls don't wear things like that. These phrases stick, whether we want them to or not. Think about the messages that you absorbed growing up. Maybe it was sports build character. If you quit, you're weak. Or good girls don't speak up too much. Or your worth is tied to your grades, or your looks, or your popularity, or your size. These narratives get baked into us so early that we don't even realize that they are guiding us here now, 40 years later. And then our kids hit adolescence and we find ourselves repeating them without ever meaning to. And so this is where family communication patterns theory comes in. It tells us that families operate along two orientations: conversation orientation, where open discussion is encouraged, and conformity orientation, where sticking to the family script is what is important. Families with a high conformity orientation, they pass down these scripts without question because it is about keeping everyone on the same page. Families with a high conversation orientation, well, they create more space to question and to renegotiate the stories. As parents, though, we sometimes unconsciously fall back on conformity orientation. We pass on the narratives that we inherited, even when they don't fit our values today. Maybe we say something like, "Oh, you'll get over it. It's fine. It's just a boy," because that's what was said to us. But what if our child really needs that moment to feel the pain? And maybe what that child doesn't need is toughness, but needs some validation. We have the power to disrupt those old scripts. And instead of saying, "Well, shake it off," we can say, "I see that you're hurting and that makes sense. How do you want to handle this?" It's a small shift, but wow, it changes everything. It tells your child your experiences matter, your voice matters, and your narrative can be different. This is about you. This isn't about me. So here's the question that we have to ask ourselves as parents of teens. Are we unconsciously handing down the same narratives that were given to us? Or are we creating space for new ones? So, like, maybe you grew up in a family where boys didn't show emotions, right? And if your son is crying after a breakup, do you hand him that, "Well, suck it up, be a man"? Or do you pause and say, "You're hurting and that is okay. It's okay to be hurting. Let's talk about it." You can rewrite an entire generational narrative. Do you make your daughter feel self-conscious about her body? That is something that can be rewritten and you can fix that generational trauma. Or maybe you grew up in a family where achievement was everything. You didn't feel loved unless you brought home straight A's. And when your daughter brings home a C, do you hand her that same script and say, "You're only as valuable as your performance"? Or do you disrupt it instead? Grades matter, yes, but they don't define your worth. Because these are the moments when we decide whether our kids are going to inherit the same narrative or if they're going to get to write a new one. Those old narratives aren't always easy to notice because they feel like they're the truth. It's all you knew. But they're not. They're just stories that were told by our family and our culture or by generations. And if we are not careful, we're going to let those stories drown our own child's lived experience. Now, let's talk about what I call the empathy trap. Okay. Because this is one that in a particular way kind of hit me this week. It's when we may feel someone else's sadness almost too much, when our empathy crosses over into entanglement. Because empathy is a very good thing. It is apparently a dying skill because this world, if I have learned something in the last few years, is that we are lacking in empathy. And empathy is definitely a good thing when we are parenting teens. But sometimes it can become its own kind of trap. We all want to be empathetic parents. We want our kids to know that we totally get them, that we're here, that they're not alone. But sometimes our empathy, it can kind of cross over a little bit more into something heavier. And instead of resonating with our child's emotions, we start absorbing them. And before we know it, we're hurting just as much or even more, I might have to say, I think, than they are. So maybe, hypothetically speaking, your teen has their first breakup. They're sad, yes. But they're also still going out with their friends. They're still watching TikToks. They're still moving on their way. Meanwhile, you're crying in the shower, remembering how you felt at 16 when your heart broke. And your sadness gets amplified because it's not just about them, it's about you too. But is it? Or maybe your child gets cut from the basketball team and they're disappointed, but they shake it off after a couple of days. You, however, you just can't let it go because you remember the shame of being left out, of not making the team, of feeling invisible. And so you're carrying their disappointment and your old wound at the same time. I mean, not that that's ever happened in our house, but, and sometimes it's even stranger. Sometimes we've lived the opposite of the story. We've seen the other side, and that makes it even messier. So, again, hypothetically speaking, maybe your daughter is the one who ends a relationship, and you remember being the person who was left behind. And suddenly you are like drowning in conflicting emotions. Empathy for her, guilt from your past, sadness for the boy she broke up with. You feel all tangled up in knots that aren't actually yours to hold at all. Relational dialectics theory, remember that? It reminds us that relationships are a total dance of opposing needs, that tension between autonomy and connection. Our teens, yes, they need connection, but they also desperately need autonomy. And when our empathy crosses the line into entanglement, we totally collapse that boundary. And instead of walking beside them, now all of a sudden we start walking in their story. We start taking up space that belongs to them. We start making their stuff our stuff. And so that's where the empathy trap becomes a problem because our kids don't need us to relive their heartbreak or to make their disappointment about us. They need us to witness, to hold space, and to let them find their own way through. So, what can we do when we catch ourselves falling into that trap? I'm so glad you asked. Step one, notice it. Notice the intensity gap. So, like, if your child seems to be moving on and you're still spiraling, that, my darling, would be a clue that your empathy has tipped over into over identification. Step two, name the story. So, recognize and put words to it that this is my 16-year-old self talking. If we can name it, it helps us to separate the old echo from this present moment. Step 3, bring yourself back to reality, girl. Find yourself an anchor. Ask yourself, what do they actually need right now? Do they need comfort? Do they need space? Do they need a snack? A trip to Starbucks? That cures everything. Redirect your focus from your memory to their current need. Step 4, practice compassionate distance. This doesn't mean that you need to be cold or you need to be heartless or detached. It means being warm and supportive and loving, but remembering that this is their chapter, not your sequel. And so that mantra I have been trying to tell myself all week. This is their chapter, not my sequel. Because as tempting as it is to rewrite our own history through our kids, that's not fair to them. Their heartbreak, their rejection, their joy, their success, it belongs to them. And the beautiful thing is that when we resist the empathy trap, when we let their story stay their story, we actually become better companions. We stop trying to fix it and we stop trying to feel for them. And instead, we start walking beside them. And that is when our empathy transforms from entanglement into empowerment. How do we parent with awareness then instead of with projection? Well, reframe it, right? Isn't that my answer for everything? The power of reframing. Coordinated management of meaning, all right, CMM, it's a theory. And actually, it's a very famous theory. And one of the creators of the theory is a colleague of mine in my department. And so I like to look at CMM anytime that I have an issue come up. And interestingly enough, my reframing identity model of communication, guess which is one of the theories it draws from? CMM, yes. CMM reminds us that communication doesn't just reflect reality, it actually creates it. The stories that we tell ourselves and that we tell our kids actually shape the world that we live in together. So CMM says that communication isn't just about exchanging those words. It's about creating our reality. The conversations that we have, the stories that we tell, the meanings that we make, actually, they all come together to build the world that we live in. So we're not just talking about reality, we're talking it into existence. So if I tell myself, this is just history repeating itself, I'm closing off the possibilities. But if instead I reframe it and say, you know what? This is her story. This is his story. It's unfolding in its own way. Then I can open up a completely different reality. And suddenly there is so much possibility out there. They have agency now. They have freedom. They can author their own chapter without me going in and trying to go back and edit it up with a pen of my own. Either way, every conversation that I have with them will carry weight. And so every conversation will become the story that we both live inside. So I should make that story a good one. CMM also, it talks about the hierarchy of meaning. It's this idea that every message that we send can be understood at different levels, like the content of the words, the relationship between us, the episode or the context that we're in, the cultural story that's guiding it all. So, like if your teen comes home after a breakup and says, I'll never be loved again. On the surface, at the content level, they're saying they're sad and hopeless. But at the relationship level, what they might really be saying is, can I trust you to be with me in this moment and let me feel this? Maybe at the cultural level, there might even be a bigger narrative playing out, like the idea that our worth is somehow tied to whether someone wants to date us or not. As parents, our job is to be aware of all of those levels. And if I respond only at the content level, like, don't be silly, of course you'll find someone else, I miss out on the deeper meaning. But if I instead reframe it and I say, I know it feels that way right now, and that makes sense, but know that you are lovable, this breakup doesn't change that. That reframing helps to rewrite the cultural story, not just that sentence. The idea of turning points comes from CMM, and that every conversation that we have gives us the opportunity to shift the trajectory. We can either reinforce the old narrative, the one that we inherited, the one that we keep on a constant loop, or we can create a new one. So when my teen comes to me with a disappointment, I can either reinforce the story I grew up with, or I can create a new story. Failure is a part of growth. You are still worthy. You don't need to be perfect. That moment of reframing, it's not just comforting, it literally changes the reality that we are building together. And that is why theory can matter so much in parenting, because we are constantly co-creating meaning with our kids. Every single eye roll or every late night conversation, every how was your day, it is all part of the reality that we are shaping. So when you feel those old narratives creeping in, or when the echoes of your past might be super loud, just take a pause, stop and ask yourself, what kind of world do I want us to create in this conversation? Do I want to trap us in my story, or do I want to open space up for theirs? Because that's the power of reframing. It's not a denial. It's not pretending your story didn't happen. It's choosing to tell a new story in this moment. That way, your child doesn't inherit a world limited by your past. Now, I think that we all know that parenting teens, it will always stir up parts of our past, because being a mom doesn't erase that girl who we once were. All of that stuff who got us to be the women we are today, those echoes that we hear, those aren't weakness. They're reminders that we care deeply. But our job isn't to let our stories overshadow theirs. It's to notice and to name and to reframe, to walk beside our kid while they write their own chapters, knowing that the awareness of our own narratives, that's a gift. It's a gift to us. It's a gift to them. It allows us to break those cycles, to create something different, to give our children the freedom to live in their own stories. So, if you've ever found yourself crying harder than your teen over a breakup, or giving advice that sounds suspiciously like something that you might have heard in, say, like 1992, know this: you are not alone. You are human. And with awareness, you can take a step back and breathe and let your child be the author of their own life. Thank you so much for being here today and always. If you've enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. That's how we will grow our community. Follow me on socials. It's Reframing Me everywhere. Until next time, be well and communicate.